Welcome to your next lesson on creating your wedding timelines. In this lesson, we will go over what your monthly timeline should look like, what your rehearsal dinner timeline should look like, the wedding day, as well as a traditional timeline and a first look timeline. So let's begin. If you do not have a wedding planner or day of coordinator, trying to figure out your wedding day timeline can be a bit of a daunting task. But have no worries. I'm going to walk you through this and guide you as to how to keep your wedding day moving no matter what kind of wedding you decide on. Please keep in mind as we go through this process that wedding timelines are just a general guide and you can feel free to omit or add anything you may need to. Also keep in mind that it's very rare for weddings to go exactly according to schedule. You may have scheduled your bridal party entrances exactly after the cocktail hour, but situations do arise where, say, it may take the guests an additional 15 minutes to find their seats in the reception space, or if your kitchen's running behind, they may extend the cocktail hour. Or maybe the food is plated at exactly 7:50 and everyone's a fast eater. You'll most likely have to move up your next activity earlier. This is one of the many reasons why having, at minimum, a day of wedding coordinator comes in handy. These professionals are used to these circumstances and can inform all of your vendors when to progress to the next thing without you even noticing the time on the clock or having to freak out because it's 8:30 and everyone's still on the dance floor and you were supposed to cut the cake at 8:15. Now you have to go tell the DJ, the catering director, and photographer that you're ready, and all of a sudden it's 8:45 and you still haven't found the groom to cut your cake. Although starting and ending the wedding on time are usually the two important key factors, you will always have to adjust your times a bit during the flow of the wedding. But remember, your guests have no idea what time you've planned for each event, so please don't stress over it too much. Have your ceremony start time be your starting point. Make a list of all the things you want to have happen or do before and after the ceremony, and then determine how long each one of these events will take place, and you will see your timeline start to take shape. So let's go through some of the key factors and logistics you'll want to keep in mind when you start putting this timeline together. If you're getting ready at your ceremony location, great. You will just need to know what time you must be downstairs to start lining up for the processional. However, if this is not the case, you'll need to factor in your getting ready timeline, although making enough time to make it to the ceremony location and to be on the safe side, I would buffer in an additional 15 to 20 minutes for any traffic. Vendor contracts. I mention this because you're going to want to factor this in when you begin planning the timeline. If you have contracted with your photographer for 8 hours and your ceremony is an hour, then the cocktail hour is another, and then the reception is 4, you know you'll have approximately 2 additional hours with them, so you could schedule them to arrive 2 hours prior to the ceremony start time, and then they could take your getting ready pictures for an hour, which would leave you an hour for your first look if you chose to do that. Also, you'll want to know when the photographer is arriving, as that will impact the time the florist arrives, because you'll want to make sure that you have your flowers, like your bouquets and the men's boutonnieres, in your pre-wedding pictures. This is why it's important you ask every vendor how much time they will need to set up and give them a ceremony start time to base it off of. Also, speak with your officiant and ask them how long they expect the ceremony to last so you know how much time you will need to begin your cocktail hour. If your ceremony starts at 4 p.m. and your officiant says it will be a 30-minute ceremony, now you must decide if you will have a receiving line, which could take an additional 30 to 45 minutes at the conclusion of the ceremony, or if you will do it during the cocktail hour, or you will be taking pictures at that time and you will just walk around and greet everyone during the reception after dinner. If you are not having the ceremony and reception at the same venue, how long it will take for all of your guests to transport to the reception location, and factor that time in, and then you can have a plan when to schedule your cocktail hour for. Also, Spend a little time talking about your photos and your photographer, and this is one of the biggest concerns and the area that gets the most questions about the wedding day and its timeline. There are basically three ways you can go about capturing your wedding photos on your wedding day. The first is to do a first look, and a first look is where you get ready an hour to an hour and a half earlier than you normally would, and you have your photographer take the photos of you and your fiance, as well as bridal party and family photos. And depending upon how large your family or bridal party is, you will want to factor in approximately 45 to 60 minutes for a small family and wedding party, and about 60 to 90 minutes for a larger family and wedding party. This has become a popular option lately as couples are opting to spend more time with their guests and enjoy part of the cocktail hour with them. Now, if you do choose this option, I would suggest also scheduling a little alone time together for like 15 or 20 minutes when the sun is setting so your photographer can capture some additional gorgeous photos. Remember, when the sun sets, the lighting is completely different. And at that point, you'll be married and the nerves will have worn off and not show through any of the photographs. Plus, it will give you a short break from the crowds. Speaking of the cocktail hour, your second option, and this is for those dead set against seeing each other before the ceremony, is to take your photos while your guests are enjoying themselves during the cocktail hour. If you choose to do this, you will want to make sure that wherever you choose to take the photos is not too far from the reception location. And your third option kind of combines the first two. A great idea if you don't want to see each other before the ceremony, but still would like to spend some time with your guests at the cocktail hour, is to just go ahead and schedule a longer cocktail hour. You could choose to do a 90-minute cocktail hour if you have a small family and wedding party to photograph, so you have at least 30 minutes to mingle with your guests, or even do a 2-hour cocktail hour if you have a large wedding party and family, so you can take your pictures and then enjoy the latter half of the cocktail hour with your guests. Whichever way you choose to do is completely up to you. My only suggestion would be to have a shot list for the photographers of photos you absolutely want to have taken, because let's face it, you don't really need photos with every single person related to you. And doing this will let you release people as the photos are completed for them to join in on the cocktail hour. Now, the earliest most guests will arrive to the ceremony is about a half an hour prior to the start time, so I urge you to resist putting an earlier start time on your invitation. It is perfectly acceptable to put 4 p.m. on the invitation, but plan on starting the ceremony at 4:15 because you can be sure even those who are staying close to the ceremony venue will in fact be a few minutes late. What you will not want to do is contract with the reception venue for 4 p.m. and then put 3:30 on the invitation because you're anticipating some to be late, because then you will have people showing up at 3 p.m. and waiting until 4:15 for the ceremony to start. So resist the urge to put an earlier start time on the invitation. Instead, if you contract with the venue for a 4 p.m. start time, actually begin the ceremony at 4:15. Receiving line. Now, this is a little old school, and not many brides these days still do this, but I wanted to mention it because it does still occur at some weddings, and it may be something you're interested in doing if you have a tight schedule. What the receiving line does is it lets you greet all of your guests individually. This is a great time for your photographer to get some candid shots with you and your guests as well. Now, there are a few ways you can do this, and it will really depend on what your priorities are that day. You can do it as everyone is exiting the ceremony venue. This way, you can take your pictures right after. You can do it as everyone leaves the cocktail hour and enters the reception hall. If you've done your first look and gotten most of the pre-pictures out of the way, schedule this for 30 minutes prior to the end of the cocktail hour and stand somewhere in between the cocktail area and reception area and greet everyone as they make their way to the reception area. And lastly, you could go around to tables during dinner. While this may take a little bit longer having to go to each table, it's a good opportunity to personally hand out your wedding favors and thank them for being there with you should you choose. Remember, whichever way you choose, plan to spend about 30 seconds to a minute with each person, so you'll want to factor in, at minimum, 1 hour for 100 guests. Cocktail hour. We've kind of already gone over this part of the day, but I do want to mention that now if you extend the cocktail hour, you will want to make sure of two things. One being that you have provided extra food and beverages for that time, and if you planned on having a receiving line, you will most likely not be able to do it as the guests are going from the cocktail hour into the reception, as that probably takes about another hour or so. Bridal party entrances. Your bridal party entrances, depending on how large your bridal party is, it takes generally about 15 to 20 seconds to announce each member and have them approach the dance floor. In the case of grandparents, parents, or bridal party members who cannot walk or stand, your wedding DJ or MC can give them an honorable mention from their seats while bringing attention to where they're sitting so your guests can acknowledge them. They don't necessarily even have to stand. Honorable mentions are usually done before the announcing of the rest of the bridal party. Your first dance. Your first dance will obviously last as long as your wedding song does, so you'll definitely have a frame of reference for time here. And if you're unsure, plan to schedule this to last approximately 4 to 5 minutes. Should you choose to do any other special family dances following this, like the father and the bride or the mother and the groom, again, add in an additional 4 to 5 minutes per dance. Mealtime. When it comes to the meal of your reception, keeping in mind that it may be dinner, lunch, or brunch, or even cocktail style, and the way you serve your meal is up to you and your caterer or venue. But there are some important details you'll want to consider in relation to your timeline as far as the meal is concerned. The timing of the meal largely depends on what type of food service you are providing, whether it be plated, family style, or a buffet, and how many guests you'll be providing that meal for. Even if you choose to do a lavish cocktail hour, you should never make your guests wait too long before the meal is served, and it should be served no later than 45 minutes to an hour after the reception begins. If you think you need more time, then I suggest starting your guests off at minimum with a plated salad or bread on the table so they have something to snack on. You'll also want to keep in mind that it takes roughly 25 to 30 minutes for 100 guests to go through a buffet line, and plated meals are generally spaced about 40 to 45 minutes apart, and family style meals take about 20 to 25 minutes for 100 guests to be served. Wedding toasts. I always encourage my brides to have their toasts begin during the meal service, and the reason for this is that when you have the majority of the room's attention, you will not need to separate time on your agenda for these to take place. The takeaway here is that you'll want to make sure that you let the first person speaking announce to the guests to please continue eating during this time. It's also a good rule of thumb to let the wait staff know they can also continue to serve and clear dishes so everything flows together harmoniously. Otherwise, you will need to carve out approximately 30 minutes for your speeches and toasts to take place, and that is if you have 6 people giving toasts, so you'll have to adjust that accordingly. Entertainment and dancing. The entertainment and dancing portion of the evening should last at this point up until you do your cake cutting and/or dessert. Now, this part of your timeline is a bit tricky, so you'll have to plan this according to how you plan on serving your dessert. The cutting of the cake traditionally took place about 2 hours after the dinner began, and the reason for this was it is generally acceptable to leave a wedding once the cake has been cut because you know nothing major is going to take place after that. So plan accordingly on your timeline. Just don't wait too late to do it so that your elder guests who may need to leave or any guests that may have children with sitters to get back to can enjoy dessert as well. More entertainment and dancing. Dessert is generally followed by more entertainment and/or dancing and is when your guests are really ready to get up and hit the dance floor. This part of the evening usually carries on until the last dance. The last call. Generally, most venues that serve alcoholic beverages at your reception will have your DJ announce 30 minutes prior to the end of the reception a last call for beverages. What this does is signal everyone that the wedding reception is coming to a close. The Last Dance. This is the last song that your DJ will play about 5 minutes prior to your guest's departure. It lets everyone know the reception is over and time to depart. The end time. This is the time the reception ends. Now, there are a few factors to consider here when planning your timeline. Your venue may have a curfew, meaning you will have to end the reception at a specific time, which means your timeline will be a little tighter. Maybe there's a noise ordinance after a certain time, or if you run over, you'll have to pay staff time and a half. Whatever the case is, be sure to ask your reception venue what time you'll need to vacate the premise by and what the noise ordinance is. This is important for two reasons. The first being you will need to include 1 to 2 hours for breakdown and cleanup. And two, if you've rented any items and the rental company is coming to collect them, you will need to let them know what time to come, depending on how long of a time they will need. While breakdowns are generally quicker than setups, I rarely have ever had a breakdown that's under an hour, and the most being 2 hours. So you'll want to think about all the things that are going to need to happen at once the wedding is done, like collecting decorations, stacking chairs, taking tablecloths and chair covers and maybe even sashes off, wrangling up your personal belongings like your cake topper and serving set, any extra leftover wedding favors, the rest of your cake, and perhaps sweeping of the floor and wiping down of the tables. Depending on your circumstances and how many people are helping to break down and clean up, you'll want to factor this into your timeline. On the other hand, if you're having your wedding at a venue you have rented for an entire weekend, or perhaps your family's backyard and your guests can stay as long as they would like, how do you know when to signal them that it's time to wrap up? Well, there are some universal signals for this, and that's 1, the bar closes, 2, the music stops, 3, the lights are turned up, and 4, cleaning begins taking place around them. If you don't want people to leave after, say, 5 hours, no problem. While you'll want to either let their staff go or pay them the time and a half for each additional hour, if you choose not to pay the overtime rates, you can have your bar become self-serve and your DJ can set you up with an iPod and a playlist. And the caterers can leave any leftover food or put out some snack foods for the party to continue. The after party. Keep in mind that 6 to 7 hours is the most that your guests have in them. If you're having an earlier reception and would like to have an after party for those still raring to go, you can choose to host an after party, whether that be someone's home, a reserved room block at your hotel that has been approved, the hotel bar, or even a local bar. Just spread the word and the true party animals will follow. Now, I know I've covered a lot of information in this lesson so far, and it may all sound overwhelming, but don't worry one bit. If you look under the download section in this lesson, I provided you with sample timelines, a sample working agenda, and that you would share with all of your vendors, as well as your bridal party, your parents, and any other VIPs. Also, if you're trying to time your ceremony and reception around the sun, say for a beach wedding or outdoor wedding, you can always go to sunrise-sunset.org, put in the day of your wedding, and it'll tell you what time that the sun begins and ends for that day. Now for some tips on your timeline. You'll want to allow about 30 to 45 minutes for the hair for your bridal party and 60 to 75 minutes for the bride. You'll want to allow 45 minutes for makeup for the bridal party and 75 to 90 minutes for the bride. If you're doing a first look, allow 60 to 90 minutes for photos prior to the ceremony. Ask your venue about traffic on your date and time and make sure you factor that in. You'll want to arrive at the ceremony venue at least 30 minutes prior to the start of the ceremony. Ceremonies last between 20 to 60 minutes. Religious ceremonies definitely take longer, so you'll want to speak to your officiant and ask approximately how much time you'll need to factor in. You'll want to also allow travel time to your reception venue from the ceremony. If you're doing photos after the ceremony, you'll want to factor in 60 to 90 minutes plus travel. Allow 60 to 90 minutes for the cocktail hour. About 10 to 15 minutes after the reception starts is when the bridal party is generally announced. 5 minutes later comes the first dance. And 5 to 10 minutes after the first dance, food service begins. 30 to 45 minutes after food service has begun and everyone is in their seats eating, the toast should begin. And about 15 minutes after the toasts, special dances with the family begins. About 1 hour after family dances, the cake is cut. And about 30 minutes before the end of the reception, last call is made. About 5 minutes before the end of the reception is the last dance. And once the reception ends, cleanup begins.